Welcome to the 93rd episode of the Jewish Drinking Show, the number one podcast for drinking and Jewish wisdom, literature, history, and more. And I want to welcome back Adam Montefiore, a guest who the first part of this conversation about modern Israeli wine history. We discussed early modern Israeli wine history in the last episode. If you haven't seen that yet, I highly encourage you to check that out. And now we continue, and I want to welcome back Adam Montefiore.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Absolutely. For those less familiar with Adam Montefiore, he is a wine industry insider turned wine writer who has contributed to the advance of Israeli wines for 35 years. He is the wine writer for the Jerusalem Post. Previously, he worked many years for Israeli wineries and became arguably the most visual champion of Israeli wine in the wider world. He has been referred to as the ambassador of Israeli wines and the English voice of Israeli wines. He is also the author of The Wine Route of Israel, as well as Wines of Israel. So definitely an Israeli wine expert. So welcome.
An Israeli wine guide. The first dry red wine in kosher wine, the first famous dry red wine in kosher wine, came in 1976. So we've jumped forward here.
That is a huge jump.
It was a huge jump. Yeah. Before that, the wines were semi-dry or sweet. Mm-hmm. And even in California or Australia, people mainly in those days drank sweeter wines, fortified wines. So it wasn't just because of the Jewish tradition of sweet wines. It was just what people wanted. Mm-hmm. But in 1976, the winemaker decided he was going to make a Cabernet Sauvignon. Mm. And he wanted some barrels to age the wine in. In those days, they didn't age the wine in small barrels, but big barrels. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have any in his budget. But Israel produced a lot of brandy. Mm. And he decided to take the casks that he had for brandy and put some aside for wine. And he aged the red wine made from Cabernet Sauvignon in his brandy casks. Mm-hmm. And this was the first red wine aged in a small cask. And it was the first international style wine made in Israel. It was called the Carmel Special Reserve 1976. So it was a very iconic wine. And it was the first really kosher, dry, famous wine produced anywhere.
Oh, wow.
And 1976 was a very important year because this was the first year vines were planted on the Golan Heights. And the Golan Heights was high altitude. Before that, all the plantings of Rothschild had been in the coastal plain. In the Mount Carmel region and southeast of Tel Aviv, where there was low altitude, low elevation, very hot, humid, not great for making high quality wine. So in 1976, they planted vines on the Golan Heights, which is a volcanic plateau, volcanic soil, 1,200 meters above 3,600 feet above sea level. And this showed the way forward for Israeli wine.
And that's a better soil for yielding better grapes for wine.
Well, if you have a high altitude, you have a cooler climate and a longer growing season and more complexity and a better chance to make high quality wine. So what happened from then on, as Israeli wine moved eastwards towards the Jerusalem mountains and northwards to the Golan Heights and the Upper Galilee in search of high altitude. So the whole industry moved eastwards and northwards from that date. And today, most of the vineyards and most of the quality wine is in vineyards more than 1,500 feet above sea level.
What was going on in the 1970s that they decided to make those moves? To do the Cabernet Sauvignon, to do the high altitude growing?
The real catalyst was the founding of the Golan Heights Winery. So the Golan Heights Winery, they came along rather like, wine lovers know the effect of Robert Mondavi in California. They came on with of the Herzogs and Hagafen in California in the kosher world. they decided we're going to try and make better wine. And to make better wine, we need to grow the wine, not grow grapes, to grow the wine in the vineyards. We need high altitude. We need to take care of all decisions that happen in the vineyard, how to prune, when to harvest. We need to want to make high quality wine. So the Golan Heights Winery was founded in 1983 after Hagafen. Hagafen was 79, before Herzog. And they made Israel's first world-class wine, Yarden, the label, and it started winning awards all over the world. And suddenly people said, wow, Israel, the first world-class wines from Israel, Israel can make quality wine. So that's where it started, with the Golan Heights Winery. And then people realized the altitude was very, very important. Flash pasteurization is an interesting subject because Yayin Mevushal. What used to happen in the old days is that you used to have to cook the wine, so it was no longer wine. So you had to boil it and see it bubble, and of course it was undrinkable. Because of Moshe Feinstein in the 70s, Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 70s, flash pasteurization was introduced, which meant you could bring the wine up to a certain temperature and reduce it 80 degrees centigrade, I think, Fahrenheit, whatever it is in Fahrenheit, and reduce it very, very quickly. And the effect on the wine was less. So this was a revolution that happened in Yayin Mevushal, pasteurized wine, happened in the 1970s. And to the extent that Carmel, in those days, made all their wines Yayin Mevushal for a certain period. It destroyed the myth that the Mevushal wine had to be a bad wine. On the other hand, what happens now is most of the wineries choose not to do Yayin Mevushal unless they have to. So if you look at the best wines in Israel, certainly the best wineries, they would choose not to make Yayin Mevushal, which I think is some sort of guide that it does affect the grapes in some way. But Hagafen and Herzog wine cellars in California do make Yayin Mevushal, which is very high quality. So Yayin Mevushal is not to be feared like it was in the past. On the other hand, to say it doesn't affect the wine at all, I think it probably does. But certainly you can get some very good wines, Yayin Mevushal, today. And the revolution started in Carmel in the 1970s, Rav Feinstein, and now they use new methods. I mean, in California, they use flash détente. They use methods where you can heat the must, which is the grape juice, instead of the finished wine. Different, like Judaism all over, that different people have different rabbis, and different rabbis have different views. And in the end, it's part of the discussion. So it's different people do different things.
Yeah. And I do want to provide some context for listeners who may not have any idea what this Mevushal discussion is about. So super briefly is that I would say wine is basically subject to a vulnerability of becoming contaminated or subject to possibly being libated to foreign gods by Gentiles. So that's a concern if it's not cooked, if it's not mevushal, if it's not cooked or boiled. But if it is boiled, it removes it from that potential, I don't want to say contaminated, potentially being libated. And so in Jewish law, once it's boiled, it can no longer be libated, whether to our God or to other gods or however that may work. So it removes it out of that category of vulnerability. So that's I guess why in Israel wineries might be less inclined to do that, whereas Californian wineries, because it's in America and Gentiles might touch it, especially in if Jews are drinking with them. So making mevushal takes it out of that vulnerable place.
And there's also a commercial aspect because in America, if you want to sell wine in restaurants, in kosher restaurants, you have to be Yayin Mevushal. Whereas in Israel and England and France and other places, the wine has to be kosher, but it doesn't have to be Mevushal. And if it bothers someone, they can ask for an opener and open their own wine. But in America, commercial interests always cross with religious interests. And if you want, as a winery, to be in the top kosher restaurants, which you do for image and sales, then it has to be Yayin Mevushal.
Yeah.
Or as you, I think you say Mevushal.
Yeah, we commonly say Mevushal, but yes, Mevushal is the but the Americanized version is Mevushal.
Yeah.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far with Adam Montefiore. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek for next week's episode, and I think some of you know Purim is on its way, and as such, we have the first of this year's Purim series, this one featuring Rabbi David Fried.
And a lot of people make this connection to what we had discussed in that episode of Maimonides, Rambam, but for Rambam, I do want to make sure that this is not, that people understand that what Rabbi Yisraelis is advocating is not exactly the same as what Maimonides was advocating. Because Maimonides said, yes, you drink, you get drunk, and then you sleep. But like here, he's saying drink a little bit more than normal, and then you can sleep and you won't know.
I think the Ramah thinks he's giving an interpretation of the Rambam, but like you said, I don't think this is the simple read of the Rambam.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi David Fried, and now back into this episode featuring Adam Montefiore.
The Golan Heights winery started a revolution, quality wine, experts from California, high altitude vineyards. And then in the 1990s, we had a new phenomenon, which was the boutique winery or the small winery. The small grower that used to sell his grapes to the big wineries decided, I'm going to make my own wine. And in 1990, we had about 10 wineries in Israel. We've now got 350. So a lot of them are very, very small. A lot of them are not kosher. I would estimate today 55% roughly of the wines in Israel are kosher. Wineries are kosher. 45 are not kosher. But most of them are made by religious Jews who are not idol observers, and made by Jews who are not idol observers. So Yayin Nesech is, doesn't really apply anymore. But if you make a tiny amount of wine, say 10,000 bottles, these wineries can't afford, unless they're religious and feel that they want to make kosher wine, they can't afford to go into kosher wine. When they grow and get bigger.
Can I add a qualification? How about kosher-certified wines?
Kosher-certified wines.
Yes.
When they grow and get bigger, suddenly, economically, it becomes worth their while to make kosher wine.
Kosher-certified.
So kosher-certified wine. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. Our most famous boutique winery is Shor Vineyards and Domaine du Castel. Both these wineries started off as non-kosher wineries. And when they got to about 100
not certified.
Non-kosher certified, not certified. And when they got to about 100,000 bottles, both of them decided to convert to becoming kosher. And the reason was not because they turned religious. The reason was economics. And the owner of Castel said he didn't want to make a wine that not all his people could drink. So it was very important for him to make kosher wine. So religious Jews could also enjoy quality wines from Israel. And since then, there has been a move for kosher wineries, for non-kosher certified wineries to make kosher certified wine in one way or another. One way is to go kosher certified like Castel and Shor. Another way is for to make a wine at a kosher winery. Chilag and Saslov in 2003 decided to make kosher wine as non-kosher certified winemakers, and they made their wine at Carmel and introduced a brand or a label which was kosher certified. And the other thing which some wineries have done recently, like this Pelter winery and a non-kosher certified winery, they have opened Matar, which is an adjacent winery which is kosher in the same building virtually. And Chateau Golan is the latest quality winery that makes non-kosher certified wines that is now just about to launch a new brand which is kosher certified.
Oh wow!
And a lot of the famous wineries in Israel followed Castel and Sora and became kosher, like Vitkin and Flam. These are small boutique wineries that started off not certified and are now certified kosher. And the wonderful thing about these wineries is they're all making better wine, or certainly not worse wine, with more third-party recognition after they became kosher than before, which slays the holy cow that kosher wine is somewhat inferior. There must be something wrong. So we can now say to people that kosher wine can make world-class wine. And if you make bad wine that's kosher, it's because it's bad wine. It's not because it's kosher. So the kosher certificate has nothing to do with quality of the wine. And some of these small wineries prove it. So it was a very important decision of theirs. But if there's only 55% of the Israeli wineries that are kosher,
certified
90
kosher.
Certified kosher, I'll get it by the end. 95% of the wine in Israel is kosher. So this is a paradox. Only 55% of the winery is certified kosher, but 95% of the wine in Israel is kosher. The reason for this paradox is that all the big wineries, for the reasons we describe, are kosher, certified kosher.
It makes monetary sense, financial sense.
So it makes financial sense. You can't, it's very hard to export if you're not certified kosher. You want to sell in Israel if you're a big winery in the supermarkets and in the hotels, and you can't if you're not certified kosher in most of them. So it makes good business sense. And there's been a revival in Israel in quality kosher small wineries, quality kosher restaurants, certified restaurants. So there's actually been a change in the last 20 years. Change.
I'm curious about all these changes. So we start in the 80s with the growing. I mean, you were mentioning 80s. The quality picked up. Certainly, we started experiencing that in the late 1970s. A greater focus on quality. In the 80s, that quality really picks up. 90s. I imagine these boutique wineries are really popping up because they see the growing popularity of wine in the 80s. Is that what's going on?
I think what happened in the 90s, there was peace in the air with the Oslo. People thought there was going to be peace. There was a better economy. And Israelis started traveling abroad more and becoming feinschmeckers and eating and drinking better wine. And the Jewish world suddenly started understanding the fine wine, because of the fantastic work of the Herzog family and Kedem and Royal. The Jewish drinker suddenly realized that he could enjoy wine. He didn't have to drink bad wine just because he was a religious Jew. Up to that point, it was there was no choice. But suddenly they realized that you could drink good wine, and it created its own sort of dynamic. So suddenly people wanted to drink better and understood more, and wineries had to step up, otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell. So there was a whole dynamic in Israel and throughout the kosher world in the 80s and 90s towards quality and variety, which just didn't exist before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, and then I guess they took some of them, I guess that momentum then drove what what's been going on the last couple of decades, then I can only imagine that the output, I mean, you said even just 30 years ago, there were not so many wineries. Now there's hundreds. I imagine the total output in all of Israel is much greater than it was 20, 30 years ago, right?
Funny enough, it hasn't gone up a lot. If you put grape juice in America is the food stuff and it's separate from the wine industry.
Mm-hmm.
In Israel, to make grape juice, they use wine grapes. So if you add the grape juice in with the wine,
mm-hmm.
you'll find the amount people were drinking 30 years ago is very similar to today.
Oh, wow.
But the difference is that then it was a sweet wine without a name, and it was a grape juice, and now people are spending more money to buy a Cabernet Sauvignon from the Galilee region. So the spend has gone up considerably, the quality's gone up considerably, but the volume, unfortunately, hasn't. Israel sells 5 liters per head a year, which is nothing. Nothing. 5 liters per head a year, including Kiddush wine. And there's another trend. Kiddush wine is declining fast. I mean, people used to, when I came to Israel, 10% at least of the wine. Kiddush wine used to be 10, 12% of the production in Israel. And now it's 5 or 6%. So it's declined a lot. But grape juice is still, Israel produces 12 million bottles of grape juice a year. And these wines are, people use them for Kiddush a lot and festivals because the kids can enjoy them and they're considered more healthy than wine. And some people even mix the grape juice with the Kiddush wine to try and
dilute it.
To get the grape juice is tastier than the Kiddush wine. So people aren't drinking that much more, but people are drinking far better and more expensively. And people are talking more about wine. There's tasting clubs, tastings. And in the kosher world, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they were making kosher wine in France, California, and Israel. Now, every country in the world that makes wine is making kosher wine. It's an incredible turnaround.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
I still believe, and I apologize to all my friends in California, I still believe that Israel makes the best kosher wine in the world and the best variety of kosher wine in the world. Because with us, the workforce is inbuilt. So you don't bring a kosher crew in for the harvest. You have your regular worker who's been with you 20 years. He knows what the winemaker's thinking before he says it. He's used to the winemaking process. And the mashkiach is employed as a worker at the winery. So he's it's not like making a wine in Bordeaux when you have an unfamiliar crew come in and start working with a winemaker they've never worked with before. So for this reason, I believe Israel is making probably the best kosher wines in the world.
Wow.
And it's also a mitzvah to drink wines from Eretz HaKodesh. And it's also a great support to the agriculture of Israel, which is always helpful.
Wow.
So that's important. We should remember that.
Yeah. And it gets, I don't know what the right term, third party, recognition in magazines and other coverage, right?
Well, we started off with, have you heard of names like Robert Parker, Hugh Johnson, Jancis Robinson? These are giants.
I haven't.
These are giants that anyone who's in the non-kosher world would have heard of these figures. Each one of them has given incredible third-party recognition to fine wines that happen also to be kosher. Now, it's very important that people realize I hope the people watching do realize that kosher wine is made from the same Cabernet Sauvignon grape, from the same trestled vineyard. The harvest is the same. The fermentation is the same. The winemaker learned in the same school. UC Davis, maybe, to make wine. The bottling is the same. Sorry, the aging in barrel is the same. So making kosher wine is exactly the same as non-kosher wine, with three basic differences. In Israel, you have to observe the agricultural laws. The workers in the winery have to be Shomrei Shabbat. Well, we're used to that. And you're not allowed to use anything unkosher in the winemaking process. So I give you an example. If I know you're a beer drinker, they might use isinglass to make the beer go bright. Isinglass comes from the sturgeon fish that's unkosher. So the kosher-certified winery will choose something else, like bentonite clay, to make the wine drop bright. But apart from that, the wine is made exactly the same way. So in kosher wine, the emphasis is on the handler, where in kosher food, it's the opposite. It's the emphasis on the source of the food. So the wine is made the same way as a non-kosher wine. And if you go to Bordeaux, the Jerusalem Mountains, to Napa Valley, you'll find the kosher winery and the non-kosher winery have the same perceptions of quality, the same way of working. So when we talk about kosher wine, in the wine business, we like to say we make the best wine we can, which just happens to be kosher. So the kosher is there for people that want it, but otherwise we're making quality Israeli, Eastern Mediterranean wine that happens also to be kosher. So that gives these kind of priority. So we're very happy to be kosher for those that want it, but we're in the business of making good wine.
Wonderful. It's very exciting to hear. For me, the biggest surprise is that really there's not a huge difference in the last couple of decades from now to 20 years ago as far as volume. That's pretty quality. I guess even though the quantity has not changed, quality has gone up, but that's still pretty surprising.
Quality's gone up, and people are more are paying more for wine, and the branding of wine has changed and become more aspirational. But in terms of pure quantity, we're still not, drinking enough in Israel. Unfortunately, people like me have obviously done a very bad job over the last few years.
Well,
so we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, there's
people to drink more.
There's a lot vying for mouth space, for throat space. I mean, whiskey and cocktails and beer. So it's not like wine's it. There's competition out there.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, we even have. Just to give you a clue about the business aspect of it, we even have an Israeli Arab-owned winery called Mony Winery, where it's situated in a monastery. They're Arab Christians because they make wine, but they make kosher wine. So it's an Arab-owned winery in a monastery making kosher wine because obviously for commercial reasons. So that's quite a nice oddity to explain the business side of kosher.
Right. It reminds me. Similar is the Taiba Brewery, which is a Christian Arab-owned brewery.
Well, one of the interesting things, I don't think it has a place in this podcast, but you've brought me onto it.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating things that I've learned recently is Palestinian Christians have always made wine at home domestically through all the centuries. So whereas Jews made wine at home, even when people said there's no wine industry in Israel, they made wine at home because they needed it for Havdalah and Kiddush. The Christian Palestinian domestic would grow grapes. They would take whatever amount of grapes they wanted to eat. They would make wine with, or they'd sell them, dry them and sell them for raisins. They would make wine with the remainder, and the person who made the wine was always the mother or the grandmother in the home. It was her job. They would drink the wine through the winter months until it started to go sour. And then when it got sour in the spring, they would distill it to make arak. So there was a kind of cycle of winemaking. So Palestinian Christians, and of course in Lebanon, which isn't so far away, the people who make wine are the Christians. They have a big, they also make wine. So, but obviously in tiny amounts compared with Israel. But it's just an aside that, I thought I'd mention it.
That's really neat.
It's a fascinating country because when you think about it, Israel has been making wine for thousands of years. And what product, if you wanted to symbolize Israel today, you wouldn't do it with the Jaffa orange. You wouldn't do it with the kibbutz anymore. You could do it with wine. And if you wanted to symbolize Israel in ancient times, in biblical times, you could also do it with wine, because wine was then the main financial income they had was by exporting wine and making wine. And in those days, they drank more wine than today because the water was dangerous, carried disease. So they drank a lot of wine in those days. So wine is a product that symbolizes from the beginning of the time that the Jewish people were formed in biblical times until now, wine runs like a thread from ancient times to modern times. It was important then, and it's important now, which is rather nice.
It reminds me of I don't want to call them scouts, but the tourists, when they, in the book of Numbers, when they said, go scout out the land, and they have each of the representatives from the tribes, and they bring back an eshkol of grapes, this huge bunch of grapes. So it's exactly.
Yeah, it's a land of milk and honey, and this is the fruit. So wine has always been, from that time on, wine has always been very important for the Jewish people, and runs like a thread all the way through our history, which is kind of unique and nice. So it was important to bring it up. Yeah,
it's the beverage of the land, for our people. So
that's right. That's right. In other countries like Iran and Egypt, they drank more beer. But in Israel, it was always wine. And of course, when Rothschild first went to Israel, they planted everything. They planted wheat because they wanted bread. They planted potatoes because they wanted something to eat. And these failed enormously because they didn't grow in the coastal region of Israel.
Yeah.
And eventually, they surveyed the land. They sent a viticulturist over to do a survey. And he wrote back, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. Read your Bible. What grows here is wine, is grapes and olive trees. And that's what you should focus on. And from that time onwards, that's what they focused on. They planted vines and olive trees, which are suited for the climate. So that's how it all started. But there was a lot of experimentation before they decided that.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you, any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
Fascinatingly, the grape varieties that the Shor family used from Hebron in those days are today in a kind of retro becoming the new indigenous varieties of Israel. So they're checking out, you'll hear names like Marwawi, Handani, Jandali, Bituni, Dabuki. And these are vineyards that have been in Israel for centuries, which were preserved during the Ottoman Empire. as table grapes for food and for whatever they were used for raisins or whatever, and they're now being checked to see if they make wine. In 2014, Rekanati Winery made the first Israeli wine, a grape called Merawi and Bituni from a Palestinian grower, Israeli winemaker, and they made a wine. And Shibi Drori from Gavot Winery is researching all these varieties. And so that's something that's fascinating. So what goes around comes around. The varieties that the Shor family made wine 170 years ago are now being experimented with to make wine. And I thought you'd ask me what I was drinking. Because
yes, what are you drinking?
Even though I'm got tea and water here, I couldn't admit to that because it would not be good for my image. So I'm drinking two wines, which I had open anyway because I was tasting them. One is the Better Argaman, which is from Barkan. Barkan is our largest winery, and Argaman is why it's interesting. It is an Israeli grape variety. It was invented in Israel, and it's grown in Israel and nowhere else. So this is a very light, fruity, easy drinking lunchtime wine. And just to balance it, I've had an Argaman tasting today.
Oh, nice.
This is another Argaman wine from one of the Shor family wineries. The 8th generation, they founded a winery called 1848. And this is an Argaman which is more rich and oaky and fuller bodied. And so Argaman is a variety that if people are tired of drinking Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Chardonnay and knowing that you can drink them in every country in the world, Argaman you can only drink in Israel. And the meaning of the word Argaman in Hebrew is crimson or deep purple. So it's this is what I'm drinking.
Oh,
so
nice.
I should say to you, L'chaim, thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing all this wonderful information. Is there anything you want to pitch or otherwise promote?
Firstly, I always want to promote Israeli wine. I'm very happy to have questions if people want information. But if I wanted to pitch something personal, I'm a partner in a company called the Israel Wine Experience. And we offer tastings. We offer tutored tastings, wine tours. We offer lectures, sometimes guest speakers. We've done it in New York, and we've done it in Korea, and we've done it in London. But mainly we're interested in people coming to Israel. If they want an introduction to Israeli wine, we can come to the hotel, we can come to the place where the family is staying and give a tutored tasting with all the explanations about Israeli wine. Or if you want to visit wineries, we can arrange to visit the winemaker that you wouldn't normally get to meet. So the Israel Wine Experience, anything to advance brand Israel and to educate about Israeli wine.
It's really fantastic. That's great.
So we look forward to hosting you when you come to Israel.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Well, Adam, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on. And L'chaim.
L'chaim. Thank you.
My pleasure.